Today my lecture is about PCI DSS. What do these letters mean? What is behind it? A little bit of history, contents, and also future. Quick overview, so basically some history. What is PCI DSS? What are requirements? What is the scope thing? Then how can you please project managers and management with prioritized approach? Then the future with PCI DSS 4, and if we have time, it's basically not, the last part about Rocket and OneCloud, this is not in Leonid's version that I sent him. I was planning to show this myself, but now we have a problem with the sharing, so I can't do this, so we might have to skip the last part. Okay, so that's not, that was the previous slide. So my name is Chris. I worked in IT for more than 20 years. I started in Rakuten in basically January 2018, and currently I'm the manager of the Cloud Platform Security Group. And I've been working with PCI DSS for 3 years or so now. Yes, thanks. That's the one I was looking for. So sarcastically speaking, there's 2 times. Like one is before PCI, and then in 2004 the PCI DSS PCI Council was founded, and then after PCI, that's when everything got a little bit better, or at least easier. Next slide, please. And previously, when you wanted to process credit card data, then basically you had to make a contract with a major credit card brand, for example Visa, and they will tell you, here's your contract, by the way, we have our security standards, you need to implement this. And you do this, and then finally customers can start using Visa cards to pay for your services. And then the next customer shows up and says, hey, but I have an American Express credit card, what can I do? And then you say, okay, obviously then I'll need to talk to American Express. They're happy to give you a contract, but they have their own security standards that you need to implement as well. And the list goes on and on. And then basically around 2004, these 5 major credit card brands, Visa, American Express, MasterCard, the Japanese Credit Bureau, as they call JCB, and Discover, got their acts together and basically founded the PCI Council, which is basically the author of these standards, for example, like the data security standard. And if you make a contract with one of these card brands, they will basically tell you, okay, you need to comply with PCI DSS if you want to handle credit card, but it's the same for all of these different brands. So this saves you a lot of time and money. Next slide, please. So the letter salad, what does PCI DSS actually stand for? I've already mentioned this a little bit. So it stands for Payment Credit Card Industry, first part, and the second part is the Data Security Standard. The PCI Council, their website is at PCISecurityStandards.org. They also have other standards, for example, the Payment Application Standard, and they have lots of different documents on, for example, forensic investigations, on cryptography, how to implement and work with all these standards. But the Data Security Standard is probably the best known of these of the standards that they release. So the focus of the Data Security Standard is obviously securing credit card data. For example, they tell you what part of the credit card data you can process, which part you are not allowed to store in any case. But it also tells you how to secure the environment, the computing environment where the credit card processing is actually handled. So one question that you might have is PCI DSS for anyone, for any organization? And that's a very good question. Or maybe it's a bad question, or maybe it's the wrong question at all. But objectively, what you can say is that the data security standard is a security standard that has a relatively high level. It's available for free, so you need to leave a name and an email address if you want to download it. But you can leave fake data, or so I've heard. And then you can get your hands on the real document and you can start implementing these features. Like other standards, for example, ISO 27000, it costs you money, so you have to pay to get a a copy of the standard. From obviously, PCI DSS has a lot of like requirements that deal with credit card data, which, for example, the ISO standard will not have. But in general, it's a relatively solid, high-level security standard, so you could do much worse than, for example, just going freestyle and say, I want to secure my company or whatever computing environment I have, and we know better than anything else rather than using PCI DSS. Next slide, please. So this is the real thing. So PCI DSS, the data security standard, what does this actually do? What does this look like? So on a very high level, you have this, on the left side, you can see this, these are called control objectives. These are 6 groups. Build and maintain secure network and systems, protect cardholder data, maintain a vulnerability management program, implement strong access and control measures, regularly monitor and test networks, and then maintain an information security policy. From a security point of view, probably common sense. Okay, this makes sense. This covers all of it. And then you have 12 high-level requirements. I hope you can see this on the screen. I don't want to read this out one by one, except for number 5. Take a look at number 5 because we will need this on the next slide. Number 5 says protect all systems against malware and regularly update antivirus software or programs. So on the right side, you have these 12 high-level requirements that are a bit more, basically specify the control objectives. And then below all of that, you have roughly 220 sub-requirements. Fun fact is, when I first heard of PCI DSS, I looked at these 12 high-level requirements and said, okay, this shouldn't be too hard. But then when I saw the complete standard, I was like, oh my God, this is so much work. But somehow we managed to do this. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please, Lenny? Okay, so this is requirement 5, the one about malware and regularly update antivirus software program. So this is the layout, what the standard looks like. So basically, the requirement with some description on it, and then you have 3 columns. One is the requirement itself. This has numbers like 5.1, 5.11, 5.2, etc. Then a testing procedure and the guidance. So what are these? So the PCI DSS requirement is basically what you need to do to basically fulfill this requirement, what the goal of this particular requirement is. The testing procedure is what a PCI DSS auditor that comes in would look at and then basically check against your requirements. And if whatever is described in the testing procedure, if the auditor can tick this off, then you pass this requirement. And obviously, if not, you might need to do some work to actually fill this. The guidance column, sometimes there's the requirement is a bit vague or maybe a bit unclear, so guidance should give a bit more explanation. Maybe you're asking yourself, how can a requirement be unclear or vague? So the data security standard, like other security standards, is trying to do the impossible, like being general enough to cover all possible scenarios for a particular requirement, but then not using like very specific, for example, technologies or company names to basically fix a requirement, because you need flexibility, but of course the requirement should be as clear as possible. Sometimes it's not possible in the requirement itself, so that's why the guidance is there. Next slide, please. Okay, this is, you have all the requirements. This is basically what you have to do, and then the other part is the PCI DSS scope. So the requirements, what you have to do, and the scope is where you have to do this. And scope is something that is very often overlooked. If you're a company and you want to do PCI DSS and you have no experience with this, then obviously you should get consultation. You should get outside help. This is not a big problem. it's really recommended. You can implement the requirements by yourself. That's not such a big thing, but you should at least get support when setting the scope. Because the scope, if you set the scope wrong, if you set it too small, then you might not protect what really is required. And then the auditor comes in and looks at the scope and says, this is wrong. You forgot half of the stuff that should be there. So you need to redo everything. Or you set the scope too big and include way too much, which causes a lot of work. So basically, PCI DSS scope is the cardholder data environment, which is the abbreviation is CDE, and it basically is everything where card holder data passes through, is stored, or is processed. So in this very simple diagram here, basically a user on the outside, then firewalls, a DMZ, another firewall to separate the DMZ from the internal company, and then you have typical departments like IT, finances, HR. You have DB servers somewhere and printer, and everything goes somewhere on a backup. As I said, it's simplified. So basically, you have a customer that inputs credit card data, for example, on an app or a website. They go through the firewalls into the DMZ, through the firewalls, and probably to the DB server, and then to some degree probably to the backup database. So simplistically speaking, that's where the card data flows through. And then you have people, for example, in the IT department that have access to, for example, the DMZ and the web server. So they are also part of the scope. And hopefully, for example, finance and HR or on a network level, logically separated, so that they can be excluded from the scope. So as you can see, if you do this incorrectly and include like departments for whatever reason because they have access to credit card data, then you need to include them in the scope, but it really blows up the type of work that you need to do. So pro tip here, if you need to do this, get help at least on the scoping, because it will save you a lot of time and money. Then next slide, please. So unfortunately, I can't see the audience. Are there some project managers there? I know Farron is there, or I hope she is. Can you raise your hand? Okay, so I mentioned before there's the PCI DSS standard is 220 sub-requirements. That's a long list. And psychologically, it's a very bad idea to say, okay, we'll start at 1 and we'll finish at 12. So there's got to be a better way. And the PCI Council was kind enough to come up with a better way, and it's called the PCI DSS prioritized approach. So what does this actually mean? They looked at all the requirements, and based on the highest risk level, they ordered the requirements and then put this into priorities called milestones here. Milestone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you need to be PCI DSS compliant, then you need to do all the requirements. But if you start with milestone 1, then you basically eliminate the highest risk that your card data holder environment faces. In this case, for example, remove sensitive authentication data and limit data retention. It might sound a bit stupid, but it's common sense. If you don't have it, then you don't need to protect it, or it can't get stolen, or it can't get leaked. It's a big risk. If you do this away, you'd be surprised in how many places credit card data shows up. If you do this away, you've already reduced scope and risk a lot. Then protect systems network, be prepared to respond to a network system breach. Basically, a lot of common sense items, like, for example, do not use vendor-supplied default usernames and passwords. If you do away with this, you already fixed a lot of issues. If you patch your systems regularly, you fix a lot of issues, and then, again, this second highest risk is already crossed off the list. This prioritized approach is very good for project managers and management, because they want to see how far are we, what kind of progress have we made, and it's also a good win, basically. So a pragmatic approach that gives you quick wins. Very much recommended. We're also using this in our own environment to give the service providers like a feel of priority, like do this first and then do this. And milestone 6 is mostly documentation. Like with everything else, it suffers a little bit. It needs to be done, but it's better to protect your environment than just have a document ready. Next slide, please. Okay. PCI DSS had different versions. So at the moment, what is still a little bit valid, kind of valid, is version 3.2.1. That was first released in 2013. This year in March, PCI DSS version 4 was released. And now, obviously, the first question is, okay, we have a new data security standard. What are the changes, and until when do we need to implement this? So basically, you have a transition period. So until end of 2023, you can still get assessed towards version 3, and from 24 on, assessments will be towards or against version 4. So, and by 25, everything needs to be PCI DSS 4 anyway. So what has changed in the meantime? So basically, PCI DSS 4 focuses a bit more on risk. So you basically need to do a risk assessment, and based on the result, you need to focus on this a little bit more than other things. There's more flexibility, a little bit more about this in the next slide. They updated a lot of terminology, for example, firewall terminology. They included additional storage options like, for example, cloud, which was not very prevalent in 2013 when PCI DSS 3 was first released. And multi-factor authentication becomes much more required. And also another thing that's very important is the payment website itself does not allow for any third-party JavaScript items anymore. So whether so basically untrusted JavaScript will not be allowed to execute anymore. This is has become a big problem in the payment card industry with skimmers. Basically, page hijacking, mostly based on JavaScript, and this is not allowed anymore. So for all of the slides here, there's references at the bottom. If you want to check this yourself, then feel free. Please check the PCI security standards page and look at these documents for yourself. Next slide, please. So this is the same requirement that we already looked at for version 3. So it's requirement 5 and 5.1. It looks a little bit different. So now we have basically requirements and testing procedures, and also the guidance column. This is the same, but there's the left column where it said requirements. Previously it says now defined approach requirement and customized approach objective. But this is the added flexibility that I mentioned in the previous slide. So basically the old way of doing things is using this defined approach, which is in basically the same as in PCI DSS version 3. So the requirement says do this, and you need to do this. Then approach testing, again, for the PCI DSS auditor, and then guidance updated. There's clarifications, additions have been made. And now what makes this more flexible is this categorized approach objective. What does this actually mean? So you still have basically the goal of the requirement. So you need to have some kind of antivirus, anti-malware installed on your server for this particular requirement. But instead of using the defined approach, you can basically set the requirement yourself, obviously you need to meet the requirement, but how you do this, you can define this by yourself. But you also have to basically write the testing procedures. So some companies might be tempted to do this, like using this customized approach and say, okay, we can do this faster and better, but it's going to be a lot of work because you need to basically write the requirement, fix this by yourself, but also write the testing procedure because the auditors then will have to use this one to check whether you fulfill the requirement or not. This might sound like fun, but it's a lot of work, and especially when the auditors need to come in and basically check all this custom-defined stuff, they will need more time, and more time for external auditors also means more money that you have to pay them. So better think twice about this, whether to use this or not. Next slide, please. Okay, if you've worked with PCI DSS or if PCI DSS sounds very appealing to you, you can actually build a career of the whole thing. So the council has different types of, offers a lot of courses. So you can basically use this for continuing professional education that you need for some certifications, but you can also, as I said, like build your own career. So you can become, for example, a PCI professional, which means you know the standard, not necessarily by heart, but you know what the standard means and you know how to implement the requirements. Or, for example, you could become an internal security assessor, an ISA, which basically means you're employed by a company that needs to be PCI DSS compliant, and you can do the internal checking, internal assessment for PCI DSS compliance. That doesn't mean you will be certified, but at least you can help make sure that whatever the team that does the requirements, that they do this correctly. Or you can be a qualified security assessor, which means that you basically go to other companies and check whether their PCI DSS requirement implementation is okay or not, and whether they're PCI DSS compliant or not. So these are just three of the possible certifications that you can do via PCI. Others are like, for example, payment application assessor, forensic investigator is another one. So this is also, as you can see on the URL, a lot of opportunities if you have experience in IT security. There's differences between the three. PCI professional is renewable, lasts for 3 years, and it's personal, which means if you go to a different company, you can take this with you. It will stay with you. It's like what basically most people know from IT certification, so it stays with you. But with ISA and QSA, they need to be renewed every year, and basically they're linked to the company where you're working at. So if I do an ISA in Rakuten, but the next year I would leave for Amazon to do the same type of job, I need to get basically recertified because the ISA certification is linked to me, but also to the company where I'm working at. And these are actually quite expensive. So the PCI professional exam costs something like $900, whereas other other exams like CISSP, I think is $650, or any of the ISAC exams, something like $570. So it's quite expensive, in my personal view. Next slide, please. Okay, PCI DSS, there's an author on Pluralsight, if you have Pluralsight access. He's called John Elliott. He actually works at the PCI Council, and he has a lot of interesting and informative courses on PCI DSS, overview, but also like detailed look at all the requirements, and he invites a QSA as well to give some like a real world views on the whole thing. So if you want to learn more about this, I can heavily recommend John Elliott's courses on basically on about PCI DSS on Pluralsight. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it already. Okay, I think I managed to pull this off in time, but I think we don't really have time for a Q&A. If you do have any questions or any feedback, then please let Leonid know.
Okay.
I'll be happy to answer any kind of questions via email or some forum or whatever. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Yeah, basically we can ask Chris any questions through the email. I'll later share the details, and you can call me and to write me on LinkedIn or any other social media our conference is available on. And yeah, basically I will forward your questions to Chris, and you can get the information from him. But once again, thank you to Chris for his presentation.